you are connected to, oh Christ, what was the name of this thing again? Past, present, future, game audio through the years, or as I like to refer to it, game sound, but that's technical. Anyway, we have the worthy Charles Deanan of Source Sound. We have Gordon Durity from EA Create, Guy Whitmore, who just jumped on when sadly Becky Allen had to bail, but anyway, I think the combined experience of the four people on this panel, including myself, is maybe 120 years in doing sound for games. So it's anyway, I'm hoping that we will have something interesting to say to the people who are tuning in. Maybe offering a little bit of perspective, the difference between what was going on when we started and in the middle of our careers and what's going on now, and how you guys are going to make us completely irrelevant within a few years. But I'd like to start out by letting people introduce themselves. And Gordon, if you don't mind kicking it off, please go ahead.
Sure. My name's Gordon Durity. I am currently, oh, there's my phone, hold on. Working from home. I'm currently executive audio director at Electronic Arts. I've been in the industry for a long time, not just in games, but in making noises and sound and music. Over 30 years in film, theater, album production, games, multimedia, etc. What I currently do at EA is I supervise a large part of the portfolio, from sports games to action games, driving across the globe. That's exciting, as well as I do a lot of R&D, looking in how, particularly lately, how AI can be your friend, not your enemy, can be a tool to actually unleash greater creativity in audio and elsewhere in the game industry. Over to you.
Guy, you want to?
Sure. Guy Whitmore. I started in 1994, Sierra Online, in the Wayback Machine, and did music and sound. Back then, it was you kind of did everything, and I did everything for those early games. Been through several companies, including Monolith and Microsoft and PopCap, with independent freelance stints between those, and I'm on one of those right now. Currently been doing freelance work for the last 2 or 3 years, and finished up doing music integration and ambiences for Ori and Will of the Wisps, and music design for Iron Man VR, and some work with Amangi. So I just kind of, and with the Blizzard team as well. And so it's been an interesting ride. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll come back to all that.
Charles?
Hi, my name is Charles Deanan. I started, I think, my hobbyist career when I was 13 in 1983, when I first started to make sounds out of a PET CBM. That very quickly became a career on a C64 and an Amiga and Atari ST and Spectrum and all of those. Then I got whistled to the US by a company called Interplay in '91, where at that point I started as their audio director, and we did things like Fallout and Baldur's Gate and those types of titles. Then went to Shiny for one game, and after that went to EA, worked with Gordon there for about 9 years, I think it was.
Yeah.
And then went back to US, started work with my dear friend Tim Kettimer at Source Sound. We co-own the company where we do theatrical trailers, game cinematics. We do some content for game, but the majority of our work right now is in the advertising world for games. So that's what I do.
Thank you. My name's Tom Hayes. I've been, well, you could mark it as 1990 or 93, depending on how you count it. 1990, I started doing sound for 4-bit sound chips, and that led to some of my first work in games. I mentioned it, Gordon, Joe Montana Sports Talk Football, that is mostly my colleague Joe Shands, but that was comparing that to what Gordon's team has done on in crowds and all that on sports games is pretty illustrative of what's happened in the last 30 years. But got some opportunities to freelance a company called Broderbund back in the early 90s. I converted a game called Myst from a messy HyperCard stack into PC. And then I was audio director at a few different game companies for 10 years. So Treyarch from 2002 early to 2005, as well as a couple others before that. And I've been in the outsource world for about 15 years now, built up the game sound department at Technicolor, and last 6 years been running a company called Rocket Sound out of North Hollywood. And yeah, still at it. So I think that looking at the arc of what's happened over the last 30 years, to people who know me, I might sound like a broken record starting here, because I think I've done, between panels and solo sessions, 5 different presentations at GDC through the years on dynamics. But the fact that over that time, over the period of our careers, we've gone from something where you're basically a flat dynamic. It's essentially a sound at a time. And if you've got multiple sounds, then they will step on each other, to the point now where, we have people complaining that the sound effects drown out the dialogue if you don't mix it properly, just like in a theatrical mix, because there's so much detail we can put into it that there's room for that kind of error, which is very different from how we started out. But I wanted a few thoughts about like how your working practices have changed through the years based on essentially the added ability to include detail based on the kind of capabilities that I'm talking about. Guy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the obvious place to start, you kind of hit it on the head with, it was more or less single sounds at a time. And now we can do extravagant detail where even one element might be 5 layers. You don't even, the player doesn't know that one element that's 5 layers coming and going. Again, I think of ambiances when it comes to that. And the only way to do kind of lush ambiances previously was to kind of do pre-mixed, things that were all of a piece. So there was a different aesthetic, and I think that aesthetic is evolving very, very we're seeing it in real time, and it's interesting. I thought it would take like from the early 2000s 10 years and we'd be like, okay, we've got all the tech and everything we need, but we're still evolving and getting more detail into techniques, both with real-time DSP and sounds that are more aware of what's going on in the game. To me, that's one of the biggest changes now. So I'll keep it general for now, but like when I think about doing a game like for CD-ROM, which is where I kind of came into this world, and I did would use interesting ambient loops, and unfortunately I think some of those habits have come forward with us, where it's like, oh yeah, I just need a big ambient loop. Well, to me that's kind of a relic. We can have things that are more real time and sculpted to the moment to moment, rather than this sounds right, but now we can have it sound right and ebb and flow with the gameplay. So that's, to me, the biggest difference.
Well, real-time control, I think, there's a separation between what the sources are and what the result is. Sometimes real-time control of a very simple loop can yield something where you wind up with, waves, winds, leaves, etc. But you're dead right that it took a long time for some people, to catch on to the use of point sources and kind of building a world out of many, many elements.
Yeah.
And I think that's still a work in progress.
Let me say one thing there. So in the earlier days, we always fought for more, right? We needed more voices, more RAM, more this, more that. But during that time frame, all of us old timers kind of grew up in creating soundscapes out of like not that much. We had 4 voices, we had 8 voices. Oh my God, we had 16 voices. Oh, we got 32. Woohoo! Right? And that mentality, I think, is still engraved. We have to do more with less. When I'm now seeing the whole slew of new folks pop in, they've kind of been trained from the opposite, where it's like everything is endless, everything is unlimited. Okay, so let's throw more in. Let's add this. Let's add this. Let's add this. So the other day, for fun, I was comparing a few games that had gone through 7, 8 years of iterations, seeing did they really become better. And I noticed that some of them didn't. Some of them actually went backwards because too much stuff was added, right? And that's still a mentality that so many folks have now. It's like, oh, let's add this layer, let's add this layer, and it happens in game. It happens in movies as well. So for us right now, most of the work that we're doing is just mainly subtractive. Like, hey, let's get rid of more stuff that was added in, where our mentality had to shift completely from, okay, let's add more, to add a heck of a lot less. And that's still where I think a lot of our games are at right now. Every time I'm hearing them, it's like, guys, turn half your stuff off and you would still have enough playing, right? So.
I can jump in there. Charles is absolutely right. You can put in all of the greatest elements. And when we're working with our teams, it's like, every contributor, people can fall in love with their sound. It's kind of like, those of us that came through the warfield of film and television, you can fall in love with your sound, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what comes out of the mix. And you're looking at dynamic mixing, you're looking at focus mixing, smart mixing. So along what Charles was saying, I agree. I hear a lot of stuff can be made, and some of it is quite impressive, but 80% of the battle is lost on just a bad mix, or a mix that doesn't dynamically change emotionally. Things you would consider if you were mixing linear, if you're a good film mixer, how do you craft those tracks coming in? And similarly, when you look at albums, some of my favorite albums were done on a 24 track, or God forbid, a 32 track. Now, when you hear stuff coming, I mix some music stuff, and I get stuff on coming in on DAW tracks that have got like 100 tracks of stuff. At the end of the day, you've got to whittle it down to the things that really matter at a critical point in a mix. So I think we still have a ways to go as far as realizing a really intentional, emotional, smart mix, dynamically smart mix.
What I'm picking up from you guys, and I would agree with this, is going from, like Charles was saying, the smaller number of channels where you had to do a lot with each sound, and each new channel you're given on the next iteration of a project was a gift from God, and you had to fill it, stuff it as much as you could. To we're at a point now where we have more than enough channels to do pretty much anything we need to do, and not necessarily all other resources, but at least channels. And we're at a point now where you need to do more what Gordon is talking about, intelligent mixing, so that you can focus it down. It brings to mind, another broken record subject of mine, Walter Murch's concepts of sound design, as in set design or lighting design, where you're thinking about the overall design of what you're doing, which is basically another way of looking at mixing. But his, the law of 2.5, you can pay attention to 2 sounds at once and maybe another kinda a little. And beyond that, it's noise. And noise is meaningful. Noise, the clatter and din of everything happening around you is meaningful. And it's really cool that you can build a natural soundscape where, there's all this detail to it. But if you're trying to make people focus on the details, then you're kind of missing the point, because that's not what the brain does in real life. So it's funny, I think that we are in kind of this transitional point where, I'm not going to try to dig into anything that you're not allowed to talk about, Gordon, but when you mention AI and intelligent mixing, that seems like the way to tame the mess without simply requiring everybody cut everything way back, although that's not necessarily a bad approach.
Yeah, I think everybody kind of, it's interesting how we circled from that first question right over to mixing and how all those multitude of elements. Sometimes when a game is being built up, it says, we all sometimes take the approach of, if it moves, put a sound on it, right? If it moves, if it animates, and then you have to go, okay, let's peel this away. And I do think that this kind of intelligent mixing, dynamic mixing, we've tried to, there's HDR, there's standard ducking techniques and so forth that we're all kind of playing with. But and I'm sure everybody would agree that we're scratching the surface barely on this kind of whole concept of, I'm working on a game right now, and the biggest question is, how do you decide which one's the most important sound? Is HDR itself going to be enough to bring the right thing to the surface? Maybe not, because it's really just about dynamics. It works well for certain games, but for abstracted games, how do you weight each thing? And maybe in one situation, this sound is important, but in the next, it's not. So HDR might not work in a situation like that. And that's where.
Sorry, for the
AI
defining HDR.
What's that?
For the audience, do you mind defining HDR?
Oh, yeah. And these guys probably could more than I haven't honestly shipped a game that includes full HDR, but the concept is you give every single sound in the game a weight in decibels. And the end result in terms of what you hear is, if there's nothing that you would think of as loud, like a bomb going off, the ambience can float up and kind of be there. But if a bomb does go off, it kind of does this, not a ducking, but the window of dynamics, what you hear, goes up to hear the bomb, and then everything below that is going to go away temporarily until it can kind of hover back. So it's a way to control dynamics and have the subtle things come up when there's nothing huge going on. Works great for battle games and so forth, war games. Any other color you guys would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, over the years, right? I mean, we've seen transitions happen from basically hard-baked effects to effects that are being made on the fly to now effects that are being made in real time using, regenerative sources. But what I've always been a little bit hesitant about is that I see teams having all these broad ideas. Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, right? And then in the end, they run out of time. And then they're all of a sudden saying, hey, I had my gun here that was 7 layers, and it was made this way so that I can duck away my low-end element when there's actually some other explosion happening. I can duck away my tail if it's too busy. Yep. And very quickly, it's like then at the last 3 months, okay, let's mix the game. And all of that goes out the window because they're like, they can't really see the leaf through the forest anymore, right? Or however you say that. And then very quickly, they comp it all down to like, okay, here's a low end sound, and here's a sound that is just the top of the gun, for example. So, but once that's done for all of these sounds, all of a sudden you're stuck with a whole bunch of sounds that have nothing but tails and noise and everything else. And then you have to play even less for the stuff to be heard. We do so many trailers and so many other things. For some games you go, wow, nicely done, guys, right? And then on other games you go, what were they thinking? Because it was literally just a wall of white noise with no definition left, as much as they can playing, because the original sounds were calmed down to sections that they were not able to actually articulate it anymore. Mm-hmm. So my big thing to folks now is don't overthink it to begin with. Don't go, I'm going to do all of this when in the end you might not have the time to do it. So think of it in a simple way that you can still play all of the stuff that you need to play. Leave off all the things that you don't need to play that are the minute little details of sounds, like perfect tails and something. You will only hear those in a game if nothing else plays, right? 90% of the time you're not even going to hear any of that. So it's like, if your system cannot automatically deal with those, and you're dealing with it almost on a hand basis, you know, throughout the years, it's become very clear that you're gonna get stuck with a bigger problem than you started with. So you might as well make the sounds as if you didn't have that bigger problem. So if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
So another thing along sort of extrapolating further, when you're working with an audio team, what we try to imbue is, you know, in particularly larger game companies, there's this sort of hierarchical thing where you've got your audio lead and your lead sound designer and your tech person, and then you have, it goes down, and then you have your more junior audio artists just kind of making content and putting it on that, sort of, you know, hooking it up or putting it onto the server, and then somebody else hooks it up. Where we're trying to do, and this is for art as well, is everyone has to think of themselves as a designer. So you cannot make a sound for a game as an abstract, that here I'm making this sound and it goes on a shelf, without the context of how that sound is actually going to play in the game. So we're making a real big effort with our teams to have people think end to end, even if you're a very junior person and you're making whatever the sounds happens to be, some Foley stuff, some low end effects, whatever it happens to be. When you're integrating it and you're playing it back, think about how that sound will be played. So along what Charles was saying, if you're cognitively thinking about when this other stuff is playing, how does this sound fit in the context of gameplay? What you find is that you start making choices and decisions where it's not me trying to make the most incredible rock exploding sound in the universe, because you know that one, and then the greatest one-off of, everyone's trying to make the greatest one-off of whatever they're doing. You put it all together and it's a total over-the-top mess. So that's, I think, is critical for whether you're working under somebody else on a team or you are directing a team, is to really try to imbue a sense from the creatives that the work does not exist in a game out of context.
Right.
How does it play? Try to think how it's going to play, put it in, make sure that you understand the mechanics of the gameplay around how that sound plays, and that'll inform much better decisions. And whoever's in charge of putting it all together and mixing it will have a much easier time. My favorite mix is the way you kind of show up. People have integrated things at the right levels and the right conception. And when it comes time to mix, because you're mixing as you go along, you don't have that panicky, you know, 2-night, 48 hours straight in the chair trying to just carve out a mix before the robot shuts you out from a check-in, you know, so that definitely does help.
Oddly, I mean, COVID in rooms is actually teaching us more about mixing now than anything else. Because I mean, you can crowd up a room with like 100 people, but now you can only put 10 people in it. So that kind of relates to a game mix now as well. It's like, you know, I'm seeing so many designers just make a sound and go, oh, isn't this the coolest Explo? It's like, yeah, but now play it 30 dB quieter, in between 500 gunshots, in between 15 guys yelling over headphones. Yeah, that explosion is nothing anymore. Right. And to get that through, to get that sense of like you are in a room with 100 other people, how to then make your sounds actually play in that environment doesn't always get through to everybody when they're crafting this one sound that has to be perfect. So
well, but what both you guys are saying, it kind of is bringing up for me how important the integration stage is and how undervalued it is. The more complex, just in terms of layering and integration, or even fairly basic, because it's all contextual. I'm kind of a mind, I'm curious how you guys think of having sound designers, rather than bifurcating asset creator, integrator, having people do the whole thing. Like, I created the sound and I put it in. Now that takes unique abilities, but you know that the guy or woman creating this sound is also implemented it and knows what it sounds like in context and puts it at a reasonable level to begin with. I wonder if you guys have had experiments in both of those directions. I've worked on teams that do both, and there's pluses and minuses, right? I mean, people can create assets, it's great. They can just jam, and you have somebody only integrating. If you have the right collaboration, that can work. but you know, I've found it's often quicker to, if you have a team of people who can create and integrate, that can be really advantageous to avoid what you guys are talking about.
I think it depends on the game. Some games need it in that way, especially games that need sounds that are built upon layers, because you have to implement it,
Mhm.
versus sounds that are a bit more simpler based, like maybe mobile games or whatever, right? Because I remember in like the early 90s when we were doing things like, you know, the Fallouts and the Baldur's Gates and all of those, there really wasn't that much tech to do multi-layer. So we did hire a whole bunch of folks that would make sounds, and then we had one person, Craig Dooman, who's now at Turtle Rock, who would then take all of those sounds, layer them, EQ them, so that making sure that things are not, you know, in the way of each other. Because we didn't have fancy ways of like, oh, let's duck the music all the way down and do a frequency dip here. No, we're happy enough that it would play on a Sound Blaster 16, right? So.
Yeah.
But we would do then things where everything was nicely frequency banded and everything else. So there is a big plus to having one person deal with the implementation end, because he can at least overview the whole banding of the sounds, where a person that sticks in their own sound might not understand, oh, my gun needs to stay in the top spectrum, my explosion needs to stay here in the low spectrum, in this level my ambiences need to be super clean because there's so much battle happening, or whatever it is, right? So there are two perspectives to it, but it really depends, I think, how experienced the game team is.
Yeah.
In my particular experience, it's mainly been because we've had pretty sophisticated tech for implementation from many, like, you know, since the late 90s, I would say. The audio artists particularly, there's not many audio artists. It's not like, you know, you've got a bunch of people just, you know, making graphics and then it goes on, then a tech art person puts it in. We really have done it end to end, where, you know, you as an audio artist, you do create and you go all the way through to implementation. There's no sort of middle person. You're working in the tool and in the tool environment. And then within that structure, there's, you know, reviews, and there's a more technical senior person that, you know, comes up with the tech doc and sort of overviews the general implementation. And they, if it's not the same person, if it's a separate person, they will work with the audio director / lead, who's got more of the creative vision, and make sure that those things are aligning appropriately. But we look for, and I do agree that, you know, having people that can literally go from their creative intention all the way to putting it in the game doesn't necessarily mean they have to build all the structures. Someone can build complex structures, but they have to understand the mechanics of it and the machinery so that they can put it in there and then, you know, see how it fits overall. By the time you get to a mix, you're not all of a sudden, there's no shock and surprise.
Yeah.
As one director says, no surprise eyes. It's like you know what you have because it's been incrementally being developed and sort of mixed as you've been going along.
Gordon, quick question for you. Are you still, or maybe you haven't, but are you still running into problems where a designer will put in their sound and then going, the other ones are too loud, I'm going to turn those down and mine a little bit up because there's a review tomorrow and my sound really needs to shine?
No, that's been curtailed. I know we've been feeling those, Charles. No, there's always those moments. It's like, you know, mixing a band where the guitar player is like, why is the lead vocal so loud? You know, so no, generally it's been pretty good because we have real frequent reviews, and I think that's another critical thing. The whole ability to now get builds, if not instantaneously, extremely quickly. So that you can hear things as you go along, so that, as I said, by the time it comes to the final mix, the whole concept of park everything we're mixing doesn't really exist anymore. You're just tweaking and tweaking and tweaking as you go along. There's bug fixing and finaling still, but being able to have predictable builds and builds that you can review ongoing actually does help, so that, you know, those early discussions about what goes where have been sorted out. But yeah, people just still do have their favorite sounds.
Why is the music so quiet? Let's turn it up 60 dB. Why are the guns so quiet? Let's turn this up 60
I know. Yeah.
Classic.
Eventually, you wind up with this flat line. Yeah, one of the key things in terms of producer education that I've dealt with related to what you're talking about is that sound is informational, and knowing what to pay attention to, like we were talking about, is it's key to gameplay, among other things, and creating a convincing world. I mean, one random example that comes to mind listening to you guys is a level where during the course of the level, the protagonists are flying an airplane and they start getting shot at by anti-aircraft weapons. And the first flak bursts happen, a good like quarter mile away or so. And so the first ones that we put in were distant sounding, and they were dull. They were not very exciting, but the whole idea is when the plane actually gets hit, you can really tell, because if the explosion is happening 300 yards away, it sounds really exciting, then there's no differentiation. And there were several arguments about those sounds, because I was like, yeah, it's supposed to be a slightly boring sound because it's creepy. It's almost like hearing an animal growl in the next room as opposed to right next to you. Producer education is a fun thing.
How would you have done that using a 4-bit sample, Tom?
No, this was post 4-bit. Okay. I'm not still in 4-bit land.
Dang. Okay.
That was a launching pad.
No, but one thing though, which is funny. I mean, in the early days, we learned how to make complex sounds on one channel, right? And
Right.
what I was actually thinking about the other day when I was making some hit or something, I'm like, I'm still doing that. I'm still trying to carve holes for each little part of it so that nothing really has to play double. And if it does, there's a really good reason for it, where I'm really constantly trying to focus on, don't just stack up sounds that don't really relate together. It's got to flow. It's got to feel together. It's got to feel like one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't, it might sound great by itself, but it's got to work in a super simple way too. And that simple way, which is really honed in the old school way, is still something that I'm really hoping that people at some point get back to, because then your games will actually sound instantly more punchier, nicer, cleaner, more followable, more emotional. More followability creates more emotional attachment in the game, which is simpler to do for games that aren't as complex, but it's really hard to do for the ones that are complex as hell. And simple sounds really do work there well, I think. So,
Charles, do you ever do like a map of frequencies for certain sounds, that kind of thing? Because especially if you're working with multiple designers, they're going to want to know where those sweet spots are for different categories. Or
we used to, but I'll be honest, I literally haven't done any in-game content in probably except for some smaller bits and pieces in like probably 6-7 years.
Yeah.
So we used to do that map all the time.
Yeah,
have this here. Use this low end for this. Carry this weight here. And now during mixes for like cinematics and stuff, you kind of do this by itself.
Yeah.
The music lives here, the explosions live here, the hits live here, the whooshes live here, right? So there's mainly like a vertical slice, and then there's a horizontal slice, like which ones duck away for which things, right? So
right, and that's what you have to do in a game in real time. Is like, I know this works vertically, but what happens over here when it happens with this other sound? And
especially a big grid.
Yeah, a big grid. Those maps, those kind of conceptual maps, I think are still really helpful with not only still, but very relevant for complex games now too.
Yeah.
For this, even if you have a bunch of layers, knowing kind of where you want things to sit is a really good, at least starting point. You might deviate a bit as you go and hear the mix in reals, theory to practice, but at least you have a starting point.
Yeah, along that line, Guy, that was one of the intentions, I think, with the last Plants vs. Zombies that we did, Neighborhood.
Yeah.
Neighborville. that game sounds really, really great. The sounds of it's like there's so much going on. It sounds by the pound. It's definitely one of the intentions there was, you know, and we've been pushing towards is instead of thinking vertical stack, stack, sounds evolve over time.
Yeah.
Conceive of the sound, a simpler sound, a clear sound within. We call it like working with a clear intention on your sound design. So, you know, it might have a strong transient at the beginning. It might have a little high bit as it goes a few seconds in or millisecond in, and then it tails out. And the sound has character. It tells a little sound story. Every sound is something that's organic and has a sense of motion and flow. It starts, it evolves, the frequency changes. It doesn't just sort of these massive walls, stacks of different elements. Pare back the elements and then say, okay, I'm going to have a sharp transient here. I only need this one or two sounds, but then immediately right after it, I need more of a sustained mid-tone one and maybe something with some, you know, with some grit to it, so that it becomes a simpler sound that actually has a flow to it instead of just these big, massive walls that we used to have to jam in there.
Yeah.
And the net effect of that is there's a lot playing, but everything has a character, or everything has their own feel to it. And the net effect is that, wow, it's a quirky game. There's so much amazing sonic candy going on, but nothing really gets in the way. Even when it's this full bore melee, there's always stuff just has intention to it. You don't get that sort of just wash of a wall of layers, which was a pretty amazing achievement that team pulled off in that game.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. Super good one.
And not just a top, middle, and bottom, but beginning, middle, and end.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think you get to a certain level of density, like Charles was saying, in a battle melee type game, then sometimes the what you actually get out of sound tends to be kind of sudden, and the lengthy detail can be a little less of a thing. Which one question is, how does all this stuff we're talking about relate to genre and different types of game and handheld versus console and all that? So I think there tends to be a flatter, kind of more old school approach with certain types of games, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can certainly work.
Yeah, 8-bit games are back and in full swing, and that's wonderful. I hesitate though to say like that a certain, whether it's a platform like mobile, has to be a certain way, because right now most people listen through earbuds and or headphones. So I've always treated, when I was at PopCap EA, I treated those at least technically with the same approach I would a basic console game, and then pared back, right? So I wasn't limiting to like, oh yeah, there should only be one sound at a time. No, there can be some really nice detail in a mobile game, and they have the power, they have the horsepower, and as long as you are, as we've all been saying, that it's still a tidy mix vertically and horizontally, you can have a lot of lushness going on under that, within that framework.
Yeah.
There's definitely more punch and stuff in a not punch, but like older school, this sound, then that sound up front in a casual game usually, but it's not a necessity.
I mean, well, one thing that we're all, sorry, I'm not saying that we're all struggling with it, but what I'm seeing in the industry where folks are struggling with, we're having more and more speakers at times to deal with as well.
Yeah.
Before it was a single mono speaker and everything had to pop out of that and everything had to be audible and you had to play the game and blah, blah, blah. Then it became stereo. Then all of a sudden, oh, we're going to do quad. There's 2 more speakers in the rear. Oh, what's that, right? But the problem that Tom was speaking about earlier about the dialogue, that's really stemming from that. I'm seeing so many folks do like, oh, we're sitting in our 7-1 room, we're mixing the whole game and it's nice and loud and we're hearing the dialogue. And okay, now it's going to go down to your TV on a mono speaker with his 13-year-old that sits in the corner in his bedroom. And all of a sudden that 8 channels of info now has to all come out of that same one single speaker. Yeah, you know what's going? That speech. That speech that they used to be there right in the front of you, nice and loud, is now being masked by everything else. So, and that's mainly what I'm seeing. It's like folks that are too honed in on a 7.1 mix and really aren't actually mixing their game first on a mono speaker and then going, okay, now how can we make it sound better for the rest of the folks? Because honestly, mono and stereo is still where a lot of folks live, right? On their headphones. So a 7.1 mix, how many people really have a proper 7.1 mix that play these games? That should not be your core primary target. I mean, when people come in my mix room from here, they see 2 tiny little speakers. That's what I do 90% of the mixes on. It has to sound good on that, and then after that, it goes to the big speakers, to 7.1, to Atmos, and all of that stuff. But it's got to sound good first on that small thing. Your sounds, everything has to translate. Your dialogue has to be audible. And that's being forgotten now so often. So
I can extrapolate on Charles, because, you know, we're going back to the old school ways. We all have our, you know, actually, well, I can't, I'm in my studio at home. I'm not in this red room. Anyway, we all have our little, you know, the little junky speaker for chucking music. That was the classic, you know, the broken speaker, the little Oratone with a plant on it, whatever it is. If it sounds good there at a low volume, you know, you've nailed it. A couple of pet peeves, I totally agree. We all have 7.1, you know, in our mix rooms at EA, and we have some Atmos rooms. This is great. I always tell our, you know, our guys that, you know, our team that, you know, that's for us. Just enjoy it. But when I'm monitoring it, I'm folding it down to 5.1 stereo mono. One of my biggest pet peeves as I'm listening to the games for the AIS and so on is I'm sitting there. My room's pretty. I've got like a home 5.1 theater. I'm sitting there, and you know, it's all been balanced based on where I'm sitting. There's too much information. And just the other day, I was listening to a game. There's so much information in the surrounds. It was like I wanted to just rip them off the wall. It was just crazy. It was so distracting, because in games we have this thing where we feel that it needs to be this full omnispheric sound because we have all those channels to fill. Let's just fill them. And a lot of the pan logic and that just the stock pan logic in the tools or that people create or use, they just pan. You know, it's going over there, so it's going over there. Yeah, it should go over there, but as it pans, it should also dip down X number of dB and get the hell out of the way, because a majority of people are looking at a flat screen in front. We still have that sort of that funneled film mix perspective, because, you know, the screen's in front of you and the speakers are around you. So stuff's happening laterally and something's happening off screen, but it's like literally just sitting right here. But I'm trying to listen to dialogue or something on the screen. It's totally distracting. So it's a huge pet peeve. Same with just drenching reverb in all the speakers. It just makes a mushy, distracting mix. What's super interesting now, though, you know, as we look at what's our common playback methodology, as more and more people play online games and or are on headphones are becoming a dominant platform. And, you know, whether it's consoles or mobile, whatever, people are spending more and more times playing games, particularly with microphones on and multiplayer with headphones on. And I had the moment of awakening a couple of years ago. I said, geez, our game's so good. Let me go online and put on some headphones and hear what so many, because people will play the single player and they'll play the regular game, and then they're online for the next 180 hours of gameplay. Yeah. The 20 hours or 10 hours that we scripted sounds awesome, but then they're spending the majority of the time consuming or playing our games with these headsets. I put it on and the tears just started flowing down my It's like, you know, the dialogue is just, the whole thing is ducking the entire mix because the voice system is totally, people are distorting. That beautiful sonic moment is all of a sudden, it's gone. So I've been telling people, okay, we not only need to put a precise headphone mix, we might actually need to have a situation where you can pick different types of headphone mixes. I don't know, how atomic we want to make the front end selectors, but headphone mixing for our teams anyway, that's the new challenge I'm putting forward, because our games are being consumed a lot on headphones. With VR now, VR modes are becoming very popular.
Yep.
A different conception psychologically when you've got headphones on your head. The whole way the sonic spectrum works is different. But we've really fallen in love, I agree, with our multi-channel amazing studios, which is great, because working in headphones all day long will drive you crazy. But at the end of the day, I do, if we follow the arc of where the players are headed and where they spend most of the time experiencing our games, I think headphone mixes need a lot of serious love ongoing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like when I'm thinking about surround, I know that, the number of people who will be listening in virtual 3D on headphones is probably 100 times the number who will actually be listening with multiple speakers.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely my first go-to when thinking about surround, even if I do a little work here, but on headphones with the Windows Sonic or the Dolby, Atmos for headphones on, and really pay attention there. Turn it on and off. There's differences between those, between Windows Sonic and Dolby for headphones, because that's what people are listening with now on Steam and elsewhere, PC, Xbox, PlayStation. So I'm curious too, with VR, that's going to be the norm. And there's how many flavors of algorithms for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we have to kind of either choose one at the beginning or mix and match based on the platform. So I don't know. I'm curious how you guys are.
Well, we do a lot of VR, and especially location-based VR. The other day, Tim here got into a nice little problem where there was all these folks that are on location will wear their headphones, but the surrounding was so loud. There were so many fans, so many explosions, so many fireworks, so many lights flickering that you couldn't hear anything on headphones anymore.
Oh my God.
So what they had been working on for weeks and weeks to make like a perfect headphone mix now became all of a sudden, okay, what can we still save to actually hear when we crank the headphones up really, really loud?
Oh, ouch.
So that's a whole other factor that, in game land at some point we might have to deal with, but luckily we don't have to deal with explosions at home. So it's good.
Yeah. So, I mean, the VR thing, that's super interesting. I've been looking into it for quite a long time, way back in the day. There are psychoacoustics that come into play with VR that you don't necessarily have in a speaker environment. So we've been experimenting and trying to have people start thinking about, those psychoacoustic properties. For instance, using Hass effect panning instead of, pan pot. How about using a delay to pan? That tends to have gives a little bit more depth, a little bit more of a binaural spread. Looking at VR, it's, where do you put your emitters? Instead of a single source emitter, if someone's coming towards you, you might need to have an emitter for their body, for the feet, an emitter for the chest or the head, because it's as they come closer, if it's a giant, you don't expect to hear one sound. Now we have characters that have multiple emitters on them as they come, if they pass over you or whatever. There's all kinds of creative problems with VR. The different algorithms, of course, Guy, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've got a list of, okay, we have our own internal, we can use the ones that are on the box. We can use the Dolby decoder, you can use the Windows Sonic. You can let Sony do their thing, which is what they do. Do we hand off object 3D, 3D objects to our endpoint and then have the consoles do them? That's great. What about customized HRTF? That's becoming a new flavor with Embody or Sony. So you can get these sofa files. We need to import your own custom, shoot your own air shape. And so there's so much. It's exciting because it's such a new area. It's super confusing as well because there are things to learn that aren't obvious. We did some experiments as far as certain types of sounds that just sound so horrifying when you pump them through a binaural process, or to virtualize them in some way, like ambiances, broad noise stuff. So below 1K, those things, if you don't filter them, just become it's a massive comb filtering mash. So we're thinking, okay, there's some things that probably need to go flat stereo.
Yep.
Straight out flat stereo. Those ambiances, they're not going anywhere. Just put them out to the stereo endpoint, and then just specifically steer more upper mids, high end objects in a binaural, in an ambisonic, whatever your situation is. Have that stuff steer more and put that through the binaural encoded endpoint. So you're presenting flat stereo with things that sound great that you don't need to localize. And then you're just picking the specific objects that you want to localize and pumping that through some sort of virtualized binaural experience for VR. And that way, I found anyway, that regardless of the final algorithm that you're using, whether it's Facebook or Oculus, whatever it happens to be, because you have just those easy to localize sounds that are going to the to the ambisonic or the virtualized 3D environment, and the rest is flat stereo, they tend to hold together. Because I've listened to our VR games on different systems. It's like, holy crap! How can you mix for this? You're gonna have like 5 different knobs to press for if you're using this setup or this setup or this setup. So I think just learning about how frequencies and how sounds translate to a VR environment is going to help in the long run.
Tom, watch Gordon's facial expression. Gordon, how about crowds in VR?
Oh, Charles. Yikes, man. Many a time trying to make that sucker go. You know what? Flat stereo.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, Lordy. I've tried, man. I've tried my best to get some FIFA crowds in a VR environment, and it's just like, whew, no, it's not there.
I see that we've, by the way, have been starting to get some questions in, so I'm not sure if Tom wants to jump to that since we have 10 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, there's a question in the chat window. If you could use the QA interface, that would probably be the easiest thing. I wanted to jump in with a question or two of my own before we go. This has been, to me, hearing you guys talk about this stuff has been massively fascinating. And I would love to, at some point, just do an hour or two of this, but this is supposed to be a little bit about like us old people and what happened, why the hell we did it. So I wanted to ask you guys that. I mean, we started in games before they were mainstream, and before sound for games was really a thing. So I was hoping each of you might just give a quick idea of why the hell you got into this in the first place. Charles, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll do really quick. So for me, is I always went after challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, my first challenge was to create a chord out of a PET CBM. Then how do you make some other thing really cool out of a C64? And it wasn't because I was audio driven, I was programmatic driven. So I was basically doing all these things to program. And then, because out of desperation one time, I started to do sound effects in a C64. I even started to do music. Ugh. My music during that time was not great. So I mean, that's kind of how I've been driven. And then at one point, when you started to grow up, then emotion became part of it. And I found that, music and sound had a really good emotional factor, which is also why I kind of came in and out of games like quite often. Because I mean, we were hitting hurdles that were like, we cannot overcome this because the hardware could not do it. I got so frustrated that I'm like, I need to stop for a year or two until the new hardware is out and we can start a new emotional journey again. And so it was actually every 7 years, and it was like, okay, I'm hitting this roadblock. What do I do now? It's getting frustrated. It's taken too long to put things in to make them sound great, to make them sound emotional. With that extra 10% would take 10 times longer to actually do. And that became so frustrating that at one point I'm like, I cannot do implementation anymore. So then I went just to the safe side, which is, trailers and cinematics and all of those things. But for me, it's always been about, creating that next thing, that next emotional hurdle, that next technical hurdle, all of those things. So
for anyone in the audience who doesn't know Charles, he has a well-earned reputation as a perfectionist. Always had.
No.
Oh.
Gordon?
Well, hey, wow, almost identical. Charles is my Dutch twin, it appears.
Literally.
I started off Commodore C64 with the SID chip. We had a VIC-20, then me and my brother sprung and got a 64. And I just started, I was, always interested in music. I love the challenge of art and science. That was sort of my sweet spot. And this magical box, the computer, was kind of that gateway for me. So I actually started hacking into Commodore 64 games, peeking and poking my way into memory address using little trackers and stuff. Taught myself BASIC in order to put my own music and sounds into those games. Incidentally, back then, EA's games were the easiest to crack, but anyway. And then from there, went to school, music school, and then, played jazz and classical music. I got into composing, arranging, gigging, and so on. And I went back and forth. I was really, I learned MIDI and computer systems in university, and sort of AI-driven, or at least event-driven music, automated music systems using MIDI. And I got a call from my buddies who were at EA. EA Canada had just started, and I met them at university to do some MIDI stuff for Super Nintendo Entertainment, the SNES. And that was amusing and super frustrating because, you could get one tiny little sample and then some MIDI stuff. So I kind of left it, and I said, no, I'm not interested. I want to do something that's got a bit, bigger wash. So film, TV, album production. Came back into it with the PS1 because there was, the CD-ROM, could do that stuff. Did that for a bit, left that company, did a bunch of movie of the weeks for Paramount, and then eventually sort of came back around again, sort of in Gen 2, PS2 era, and sort of stuck it in at that point. For me, it's the combination of the challenge, it's the art and the science. Back in the day, there was, can I make a game on a PS1 that could model an experience that you would hear on a TV show or in film? That was always a huge challenge. Can we get to the point where we can squeeze the box so hard that there's a moment where the experience is so good it's almost indistinguishable to an emotional experience you would get from a good film or TV show. So that was kind of my prime motivator.
I think for me, just real quick, as we're running low on time, it's the same kind of thing. I was a musician, engineer, and got interested in computers and found this was a way to combine all those different kinds of geekiness and artisticness into one thing. And I've never found anything that combines them in quite the same way. But Guy, do you?
Yeah, really short. It kind of snuck up on me. I wasn't thinking about games. I was actually doing some of my first professional work was music for live theater productions, not musical theater, but just live theater, sound design and music design. And also did installation work and things that were aleatoric in terms of music. So when a game opportunity came my way, it was like, I hadn't thought of that. So people always hate me. It's like, how did you get your gig? Well, somebody asked me, and I applied and got that gig at Sierra and haven't looked back since because I love the interactive nature of the medium. And, that just hooked me from there on. And it combines what I was doing in live theater, indeterminate timings and cue-based music and audio, and and the way that even the way the team is structured. And now I also love being in a budding industry where not all the rules are firm or slowly evolving, but quickly evolving has also been really fun for me as well.
Going over to questions real quick. So Kirill in Ukraine asked, basically, how do you, I think, and please pardon me if I'm paraphrasing, how do you stop? How do you overcome the fear of creating audio textures for an entire scene, nature, battlefield that's going to be the bed for all sounds in that scene? And it's, where do you, how do you know when you've got it right? How do you know when you've got more to do? Do you have any thoughts on that? When I'm thinking, I think that this largely would refer to, big games with a lot going on, because I mean, the old saw, our great art is never finished, it's only abandoned.
Yeah, so I'm reading the question a little bit different in terms of
Okay.
is it just that he's basically asking, is it just that you're making your bed and all of your sounds, and then just during through endless trying to actually get a mix to happen at the end? What we always did before was try to get that sorted early on. Like, what's your vision? Make it as a scene in a DAW. What will your hurdles be? Is it the gun tails, or is it maybe the tonality of cars compared to music? Is it maybe this crowd that constantly is in a way? All hail to Gordon for overcoming that issue. But all of those problems are happening, and they have to be early figured out. So you don't go and make all of these assets and then figure out during the last 3 weeks, oh my God, all my guns don't work. Right? You have to figure out very early on what is working to actually make it in a prototype. Like we do a fair amount of prototyping for developers where they hand us a scene of like 12 minutes and go, how do you guys feel that this should sound like? Do all of your design for it, and then let's see what we can then pick up from that in order to make it work in the game. And I think that's a really important part of it, because then you have a goal, you have a target, all the people working on it really understand this is what we're doing. So
yeah, I'll back that up, Charles, 100%. I know he really pushed that at EA, and that's an ongoing dev process. It's, you work with a role model, as we call them. I love to, start with a well-produced. Ideally, I like to get another perspective. So we'll hire, in the past we've hired Warner Brothers or Charles or whoever. And once you can get that role model established from another creative point of view, and you discuss what the end result is, as you progress throughout, it becomes a razor, because it's easy to get lost in the weeds, falling in love with a process, or God forbid, a little technical structure that you spent 3 months building. How cool is this? It does this, it does this, it does this, and at the end it goes beep. It's that's awesome. It's a single sample for that. But it helps put it in context, so that when you pull up the role model towards the end, middle, particularly I love pulling it up towards the end of the project, and you bring it up and you A/B it, you go, did we hit it? Did we exceed it? Are we, it does help focus the work. It also helps communicate with your team and your production team, not only just the audio team, but the other parts of dev, what the audio vision is up front. And then on the audio team, everyone is aligned to that vision. So when you are making your content and you are making your assets, depending on what, part of it you're doing, you can dial it up and go, oh, okay, so maybe my water ambiences are good enough, because it doesn't seem to be, this is not a game about water falls,
Some games are. Yeah, I would totally agree that having early, whether it's, we call it a paint over, where we paint the audio and music over a capture, is a good way to start. And then to do a vertical slice, as the industry loves to call it, of a specific scene and nail that. in a perfect world, it's in pre-production before you even get in the full grand production, and you know what not only what the aesthetic is going to be based on an offline demo, but you also know what the tech needs to be for integration in the build. And sometimes in the build itself, you go, oh, we can do this, that things we couldn't even do in the linear paint over. Another thing, because that's always the wishful thinking that a perfect vertical is going to happen all the time. More and more, I like to have options available in the game engine, if I'm using Wise or something, especially if, the question was about ambiances. And if I have elements, I often create like a whole bunch of elements that fit within the agreed aesthetic, so that when it comes time to mixing, I use state-based mixing to say, oh, you're over here, I can tone this sound down and that one up. And some of these things might not happen until other elements make their way into the game. Oh, wow, I didn't hear this creature or this weapon I want to, or this, the designers changed something. Oh my God, right? That never happens. So having the ability to react in real time and not necessarily to have to go back to your DAW and make that full round, or maybe different sound designer. But if you have these elements in your audio engine, which is a DAW, in my opinion, then you can kind of go, oh yeah, I can adjust to that. I can react to that really quickly if I have some of those, a palette, if you will, all ready to roll.
I mean, what is a negative effect of that? We did a title early on where we said we need a lot of longer sounds. We need a lot of explosions. I think this was a first Matrix game. And so the programmer had developed a engine where we could do 9 or 10 like streams. I'm like, okay, great. I'm not sure how you're pulling it off, but awesome, right? Then very quickly at the end, it became figured out that, oh, it is actually not possible because there's latency, there's other things. And he was trying it out on his workstation and not on the actual hardware. Yeah. And then the whole game was designed around having all of these streams available, which I was doubting would ever work, but it worked for a while. And all of a sudden, during the last 3 weeks, we had to redo almost everything because we were narrowed down to 3 streams instead of 9.
That's why you got to have the tech tests to make sure you have it. Another thing I've been doing more is, if it's like, oh, I need a little delay on this, you can bake it in at when you're building stuff. So now you can do DSPs or even layers in a game audio DAW and then bounce it and bring that asset back in. It's like, I've used 8 layers, but I don't need 8 layers because it's not dynamic. Maybe I need 3 or 2. Yeah. By the end, I would like to see more of those features in game audio engines where it's easy to bake and boom, it's right there, so that there's not that round robin trip back to the DAW. The more and more I work in engine, the more I think that would be really, really nice. Then hopefully you could have best of both worlds, where it's like in the end I can optimize. You have this last phase of we got it sounding good. Now, yeah, we don't need 8 layers, we need 3. Bake them down rather than right in the audio engine, not in the linear DAW.
Got it.
Going with it's just with what Charles was talking about, a little stupid war story. It was a major open world game that I won't name for PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, and the spec that I was given was that we had 2 streams for music, so we could crossfade, and we had 2 streams for ambiances, for backgrounds, so that so we could crossfade. And so the world had basically the music would come and go situationally. It wasn't wall-to-wall music. And during alpha, basically after feature lock, where the only bugs that were going to get fixed were things that crashed the game, they decided that they had to cut the number of streams in half. And so when you play that game today, then when you come to a spot, if you have the music slider turned down, if you come to a spot where there's supposed to be music, then you hear nothing. Yeah.
Tom, we have 2 more questions.
Yes, please. So do you guys feel like innovations, this is a good and difficult one. Do you guys feel like innovations in game audio are accelerating? In other words, would you say it gets increasingly difficult to keep up with the industry and stay on top of it?
I'll jump in. Yes and no. I mean, we live in an industry where you always have to keep up on, there's formats and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's also, I also feel like the things we learned 20 years ago are still relevant or become relevant again, like memory savings, you know, and we have an advantage to having gone through those times and getting some of that discipline that was required early on. So that's.
I can jump in as well on that. Yeah. It's, you know, being steeped in audio technology, that's part of what I got my degree in. I get frustrated with how slow it's actually been. I mean, ambisonics is hot now. Ambisonics, I studied, it was in the 50s. You know, it's like so much of the stuff that's there, like multi-channel. Charles Ives did at the Chicago World's Fair, did a 52-channel like spherical projection, and that was discrete, custom made, all analog, you know, crazy mixer. So while it seems that there's a lot going on, what is great is that the power, the DSP, the raw crunching power, the computing power of the consoles are finally there. The conception around what to do with them, that's now starting to evolve. But I think it's a little behind. I mean, I was really psyched to see a Microsoft Triton. If you don't know what it is, look up Microsoft Triton. It's quite interesting. It's a theory that's been around for a while about baking audio features from a geometry into the actual voxels on the screen. And then you basically have a huge data field that you can then parse through in real time and get amazing, great reflections. It's now calling it Project Acoustics. Well, there it is. Fantastic work, built on theories that go back decades. So while I see the technology is improving because it's actually being codified and made public and accessible for more powerful consoles, there's a bunch of technology still that I'm sitting there going, when is this going to happen? You know, it's been 25 years. Somebody bring this into bear. But it is definitely exciting times that audio is getting the computational power to do some really interesting things on the new consoles.
The thing is, here's how I'm kind of seeing it. So in the older days when Sound Blaster Live had all of a sudden extra RAM, everybody went like, oh, now you can do all sorts of stuff. Nobody ever used it, ever, right? So it's the same now. You can do all of these things, but the more you can do, I mean, if you would go to a programmer on a game team going, hey, we want you to actually create a part of the engine that does real-time creation of, you know, sword scrapes and clangs and this, and here's all of your input. Now have a AI thing, you know, recreate that. He will probably look at you going like, yeah, maybe in 5 years in the next game, we actually have 2 years to make this. So this is kind of reserved for the big few companies that actually have the raw power to do this. EA luckily being one of those. But I'm still seeing a lot of other developers just even struggling to have one audio programmer. Maybe they finally get one and it's like, okay, he can now do hookups and he can actually make it that we can do crossfades. Not even thinking about how to do all these extra new things. So our hurdles are, I think, not so much like if we can do it, we can do them. We could even do a lot of those already on the old platforms, but whether you actually have the manpower to do it.
Or the commercialization of those products, right? Like, so doesn't make sense for a game developer to reinvent a wheel of making an audio engine. So we have some big in-house engines, but we also have third-party engines. And I think everybody's point goes, this tech has been around, a lot of this tech has been around for decades and so forth in academia and other studies, and now it's just being commercialized. And now, like with music, you know, people say, what do you see next in adaptive music? It's like, well, what I'd like to see is a broader adapting of what we've had for a long time, you know, and a broader methodology and tool set that people can jump into, so game developers don't have to reinvent these things from scratch every time, that we can take what's been done and build on it incrementally. You know, so that's kind of where I see things going in the near future, because we have all this, we've all had these great ideas, and you know, it's commercialization, production, and getting the practical meat and potatoes. We need a larger foundation before we can kind of build on top of that.
Go to your producer and go, hey, you know what? I want to do all of this and this and this and this. Or you can use that programmer to do game functionality. Which one do you want to do? You know, they're going to always choose for the first one. So it's always been that uphill battle of getting enough manpower. And I'm happy to say that EA in the end did and still do now, but I just feel bad for all these other developers that are literally hitting that hurdle every time and have to rely only on a third party. And even then, to get that properly hooked up in the game might take years, right? So that's really, I think, our hurdle is to get that time to actually use the power correctly.
Going back to Justin's original question, in terms of, does it become increasingly difficult to stay on top of innovations? I think that not to try to pump up the people on the screen right now, but experience is huge. I admit I was watching American football the other day, and there was a young quarterback who's extremely talented, and there was a point where you could tell he just didn't know what was going on the field. There was too much happening too quickly, and the commentator correctly said, that's because he's a rookie. And you see the same guy 15 years later, after he's been doing it for a while and he's been filtering all these inputs, then it becomes a lot easier to deal with. And I think the same is true in any field of any complexity. And I think that has to do with game audio. You give Gordon new technology, he's going to just gobble it up. You give it to somebody who is who's just in those beginning stages of really understanding the tool sets and what the game needs, then that might be a lot more difficult. So I would just say, keep learning, keep an open mind, avoid the mistake that I've seen some noobs make through the years of, I don't know if you're a newbie or not, I apologize, but that I'm just saying I've seen people make of feeling like they need to come off like they know everything, and so they wind up having a bit of a mental closure and they're not constantly absorbing, because you really have to. And that's the thing, this is an innovative field. If you don't enjoy constantly learning new things, it probably isn't the right field for you.
Yeah. So Tom, there's a whole slew of other questions from some really heavy hitters there. So pick one.
I know 90 minutes won't be enough. Okay, let's see. Try to go in order. Dave, hello, Dave. What is everyone's goal for the next generation of audio professionals? What do you want to hear from them now and in the future? I think this is a great question, because each of us has been in a hiring manager position in this field many times.
Yeah.
So.
I'd love to jump in here, because even as a freelancer, I hire contractors to help me out on various ends. What I'll say is there's a large, humongous slew of composers, media composers, and a large slew of sound designers, but very few who really understand the end-to-end process of creation all the way through integration. And even if you're not the person who ultimately does the integration, understanding conceptually what goes on in there and being able to communicate with your audio director, whoever's overseeing you, your audio lead, is key. And you know, how many jobs for audio implementation, sometimes it's called technical sound designer, which I'm not a fan of that title, but that's what's sticking. I've seen more job openings for that than pure sound designer. That's anecdotal in my estimation. And for the people I tend to look for, I want that as part of the resume, as you know, again, part of that building up the foundation of people who can do some of this stuff, and even scripting, so that you can take the more weight we can take off of the dev team, including scripting and maybe even audio programming. I'm seeing more outsourcing places getting programming abilities on board as well.
Gordon?
I'll jump in there. So yeah, I've done a lot of college and university outreach over the years at EA, and the question comes up all the time, of course. And I say, like, it's sort of break it down into 3 or 4 parts. The first part is, regardless if you're more technical or purely, I would say creative oriented, is like, you're in sound, it's all creative. Technical work is creative work. You have to have a conception first. Can you communicate emotionally with sound and music to media, to film, TV, whatever it happens to, live theater, whatever it happens to be? So that's part 1. Can show me that you have the capabilities to post something in a multi-channel mix to some picture that moves, shows originality, creativity. And I'm not just talking doing another StarCraft redo or Transformers, because we all know the guys who did Transformers and they do it really well. So surprise me, like, do something quiet, do something loud, whatever it happens to be. That's the first thing, that creative conception. The second thing is, can you do something that show you can demonstrate that you've got any kind of interactive capabilities? This is now super easy because we have Ys that you can download. You've got Fmod you can download. When I was coming through the pipes, there was no game engine out there. You kind of had to just do whatever you could, hack into whatever you could do. There's lots of online resources available. So come up with a demo. Come up, you can do a Wise demo off a stock demo, come up with just a Soundcaster demo, whatever it happens to be, as part of your demo. Look, I can take this creative concept and break it down into something interactive that can still communicate. So always dealing from the creative output. And then thirdly, I would say, is, apart from implementation skills, and this is one of those things, dialogue. It's like the final frontier. We've gotten good at great sound effects and sound design in games. We've gotten really good at some music being played back, recorded well, written well, implemented well. Dialogue, for the most part, is still in the dark ages. It's very linear. It's linear. If it's in a cutscene, great. It's awesome. The cutscenes are like movies. They're fantastic. And you go into real-time gameplay, and it's like, hey, over here. Hey, what are you doing over there? Give me another bullet. I'm all out of bullets. But you've been out of bullets for the last 12 missions. You should do something different. You know what I mean? It's like contextual dialogue. So if you can show me that you have a capability to think about language, how language is spoken as a human being in a contextual way, that gives you a notch up. Because that's kind of like a holy grail. Not just, we do that a lot in sports, but in non-sports games, that's a big sort of thing, is how can we get the new digital human, as they're all pushing to get these digital creations to sound more human or be more human. And one part of that is is intelligence. Can they actually say things that make sense because the context has changed?
Yeah, it seems to me that it's actually it's an interesting point. Dialogue, I feel, is one of those things that hasn't changed all that much. Sonically, it has. I think that it's not being recorded like a, when we started out, everything was recorded like a radio commercial. So things are being recorded in a much better way, and there's more naturalism, which is great, and it feels more immersive and cinematic. But in terms of its usage in game, it tends to be very, very functional, very just part of the game mechanic. So it's kind of a game design thing. I mean, I'd be interested to see what a newcomer or a student or someone could hand you as a demo that would really show that, because I feel like all of our hands are somewhat tied by the way the games are designed.
Yeah, that there was a certain, but when you're making a demo, we influenced the design quite a bit by just presenting things to a dev team that they didn't know was possible. Been my ongoing thing with shooters. I've been forever trying to get more contextual dialogue into shooters, because a multiplayer open melee is essentially like a sports game. It's conditional. Whatever's happening is happening. So in those modes, it should be way smarter and less repetitive, So as someone demoing, Wise has got a little, sort of dialogue conversation engine. Pick content from a conception point of view. If you approach it with a different way of thinking about how people speak and the context around how they say things, then you can easily demo that in a Wise demo. And we've done stuff with teams where, they said, oh, we only need a couple of characters saying this here and this here and this here. And as I sit down, I quietly listen, I'm writing notes. And the guy says, yeah, he said, not much dialogue. I said, well, would you like that character to say that he's a friend or foe of that character? And then do you want him to talk about what happened on the last race, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, that'd be great. So by the end of the 1 hour meeting, I write down a shitload of dialogue, right? It went from, we want nothing. To make something light and conversational requires a depth of content and a depth of methodology to play it back. So it doesn't seem repetitive or forced.
Interesting.
And that takes collaboration for sure. That's the other.
Yes, absolutely.
Charles, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'll give Dave the answer offline. So,
Bob Rice, hello. What are your thoughts on interactive technologies emerging in competitive sporting events, ball games, racing, etc.? There's another 2-hour session at least with what are the obvious challenges there where interactive sound designers need to innovate? We have at least 2 people on this call who've done a crap ton of innovation both in those areas. I know that Gordon has been instrumental in EA's crowd systems, which amaze me every time I hear them. And Charles is kind of the godfather of racing games after his years on the Need for Speed franchise. And if there are other things that you guys have done that I don't know about, then I apologize. Those are the 2 right off the top of my head. Charles, any thoughts about the state of the art in racing games?
I think Gordon needs to take this one because I know what Robert is honing at. So,
okay.
What's he honing at?
Basically, imagine if you do a sporting event now in a COVID way, and you need to figure out how to do crowds and everything else as well.
Okay, so great question, because that was one of our major kind of unpredictable positive results that came out of COVID. So, we do FIFA, Madden, so NFL football, NHL, bunch of sports games. Initially, the league, FIFA was the first, approached EA and said, look, we've got all of these games, all these stadiums are empty. These guys are playing there. The broadcast kind of sucks. And before that, last year, we had a call from, I forget what league it was. There's so many leagues in football, soccer. Said, hey, we have this league coming on, but we can't get our broadcast to sound like FIFA. So could we use some of your content and then make our broadcast with that? And that was last year. And we always had a joke that at some point, we're trying to emulate broadcast, but we're going to get so good, broadcasts are going to want to emulate us, ha, ha, ha. Well, it actually happened. So with COVID and no one in the stands and they have these weird cutouts of people, it was a really bland experience. So one of the guys on FIFA basically created I won't get into it, created a soundboard. So that's basically got a whole bunch of samples from different FIFA games with the chants and the whole thing. And then basically some of the playback, you couldn't give them Frostbite to play it back. Right. How would a broadcaster or somebody on the broadcast team play back the crowds in an easy way? So using MIDI, some intelligence built into some Ableton patching, and then the content layered in a certain way, pretty much laid it out on a keyboard so that when you ran, you basically fire up the Ableton project and you hit go, and then it plays the beds and it does the things, and then the person playing it can hit the appropriate cheers, and it has a certain amount of logic and so on so that it plays well. So when you listen to every FIFA or basically broadcast soccer game or NFL game or hockey game on TV everywhere. That's the stuff that we did in Burnaby and in Florida.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of fun that it's one person deciding what the crowd's going to sound like. I forget who they were playing, but there was an Eagles game and the quarterback was not having a good quarter. At one point, the hometown crowd booed their own quarterback. And there was this one guy who's like, God dang it.
Right. Not an Eagles fan.
That's performer bias right there.
Right. Right. You know, the only thing I'll add is, first of all, it's certain for me that this kind of work, I haven't done it. I have done some live VR, not live, what do you call location-based VR. But it's back to like live theater. It's like a live theater production for this stuff. One thing I see with colleagues of mine, you know, I'm still squarely in games, but I have people using these, not people of mine, but friends who are in related industries that aren't game audio using these skills. And it's interesting to see our vocation broaden out to AR that isn't game related, or, you know, things like this. So it bodes well for those of us who have these skills, because it's not shrinking. It's a broadening pie in my view.
Absolutely. Well, you know, it's been, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thing. Yeah, as far as the exponential growth of interactive audio, it's like, you know, I was telling somebody last year, I've never seen so many people in adjacent industries looking for people with interactive skills.
Yep.
You know, there's I think it was Ducati or some other motorcycle company. They've got electric motorcycles, but a large part of the motorcycle experience is the sound and the vibration. So they were talking to somebody about how would you put together, you know, something that felt and sound like a, you know, like a Starcraft or a classic Ducati. Say we want to have in our Ducati, we want to have all of the classic Ducati sounds, as well as work again into the frame, some sort of resonator so that it could actually vibrate as well. So it's very interesting stuff that's sort of adjacent to games, or not at all, but is still using interactive skills.
And what one of my hopes and dreams is that, because we're now all of a sudden facing a arena where sports are becoming a bit more, you know, home-based, honestly, you know, you want to almost make that experience a bit more for yourself. So you don't want to hear a crowd maybe that is cheering for the other team, because you're actually in the state where they should be in. So it's for me, I think, a lot more about customizing the end user. So Formula One has started to do that at one point, where they said, hey, you can now start to watch, you know, this driver and this driver. But it's like a little bit kludgy, because you have to go there, you have to like select that driver, and then you have to go to someone else and select that driver. What if in advance, just like in a game, you could set some preferences going, hey, I want to see these 5 drivers. I want to kind of hear commentary about this. I want to, you know, I really like this guy. I want for this guy to win. And you kind of get this AI commentary that would match what you're expecting to hear, and that makes you feel good. So that's, I'm hoping, where this type of sports will go towards. That's a bit more based around the person that's hearing it at home, versus a global, you know, do it for everybody.
Well, choosing who the crowd is cheering for based on your preferences sounds like social media. I'm not so sure. Hey, let's grab at least one more question. We're coming up on an hour and a half here. So Brian Schmidt, hello. We get excited about new technologies in tech a lot. What have you seen come that you were originally super excited about that turned out really not to be a big deal, and not get adopted?
I'll stay quiet.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is what you were talking about, the you know, onboard RAM on sound card. You know, I thought that sound fonts, then, you know, DLS, downloadable samples, and direct music, I thought all that was going to be a game changer, and new technology came along and kicked it away. Basically, everything went to streaming.
Yeah, and that one gets to the idea of, the issue with general MIDI
Mm-hmm.
and specific amount of RAM on a specific card was, it was way too hard to give everybody kind of a uniform experience. I mean,
Right.
we expect variation, but within a certain range. And the difference between somebody with a Sound Blaster high end or a Roland 60, whatever it was, Sound Canvas versus an FM card was way too grand, way too great.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that died on the vine in particular. But yeah, that's one. Direct music, on the other hand, is one where it's an interactive music technology that had so much power. I always describe it as the Ferrari without a steering wheel, because it was so hard to drive. But you see now its concepts and even realizations starting to bubble back up. So we kind of see this, oh, look at all this potential. Boof, it must have went away. No, we want it. So some of it's like the stock market, where hopefully it goes and comes back. The good stuff, that we want will come back in a different form. So sometimes it's how it was rolled out that wasn't as relevant or accessible.
Well, some of this circles back to what Gordon was getting at, how some of the more advanced technologies we've seen in games come from things that have been around in academia or modern art for a long time. And I think maybe direct music is an example of something that couldn't always sound great for a lot of contexts at the time that it came out, but those same concepts are there. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that before I got my first job, I had a few classes with some really smart people in fields of psychoacoustics, computer music, all that sort of thing, talking about stuff that is not directly applicable to making a noise come out of a product, or certainly wasn't at that time, but it's kind of made a lot of these developments make sense over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with Gordon. I'm really excited to see more and more of these things actually becoming practical and good sounding, because sometimes these things come out and they'd be really cool and fun to play with, but they wouldn't sound that great.
Right.
Like general MIDI on an FM card.
Yes. But the flexibility of MIDI is still powerful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a control system. It's not a sound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, during the last 35 years, there's been so many times that, the concept of 3D audio started and then died. So it's like when 3D TV started, I'm like, well, that's going to die soon, everybody. But he goes, no, it's going to be well, 3 years later, it's dead. Nobody's selling another 3D TV. And that's been the same with audio. I mean, you had spatializer, you had RSS, you had all sorts of other things. Then it was like, oh, let's use ambisonics for this. And it's like, guys, in the end, you're still focusing on the wrong thing, which is make it sound good first and then play with all these other technology things. I mean, now we're finally at a spot that is really well integrated into the hardware. So at least you have some ways of actually using it correctly. And at least it's not going to distract away from actually making a game that sounds good and then using the other technologies, including Atlas and everything else, to then enhance it further. But is that the core part of it? No. So I'm not really excited about any of those, 3D technologies that have been coming and going into games. So
the one thing that, as far as it didn't go away, it kind of was there and came back and was there and came, is advanced haptics tied to sound. So if you're looking at immersion, like when these moments happen, we've all had them, where for some reason, the right sound, the right animation, and the right rumble effect all came together in this rare moment. It's happened maybe 3 times in my life where it accidentally happens. And it's like, wow, that was way immersive, even though it's like a cheesy little rumble. And it was like, if the individual pieces were not that high fidelity, but the coming together of the gameplay moment and everything was just, that made a ton of difference. And there were talks about different types of haptic systems that were coming in and out, and there's so many different approaches. The little speaker on the controller, that was super hot. Everybody was putting stuff in the little Sony speaker because it was, and then nobody did it. So it's back now. It's tied into the Sony advanced haptic system with the being able to drive haptics on the PS5 with audio, like multiple audio waveforms that you could craft yourself, as well as using the speaker and so on. So that, to me, anything that you can increase the level of immersion creatively in a simple way to the player, it's something you can just pick up and use, and it doesn't mean strapping on bibs and harnesses and goggles and tethers. You can just hold it and play it and experience it really naturally. Those are the technologies, the practical technologies that excite me, because within that little box of audio tied to haptics, there's so much potential for new immersion and new immersive experiences.
But since it's Brian Schmidt, the best thing that ever happened was just being able to play any samples on your PC speaker, right?
More FM synthesis.
Yes.
No, I mean that was one of those things when I remember this was the early '90s. Hey, you could play a voice on a PC speaker. Oh my God! And then it just died. Everybody got actually a speaker that you could hook up to a PC.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh God, that was some kind of weird square wave modulation tech. God, yeah, it was ugly. I remember that. Well, we're currently at 96 minutes. It's supposed to be a half hour, but I just want to touch on this last question. We've already, I think, approached this. I struggle with engineering support for all this innovation. Do you look for the new generation of sound people to have scripting or coding skills? I think Gordon touched on this pretty well. Somebody who's going to be part of the sound team needs to understand sound. I've found that most people who are good at sound design or mixing have become pretty good technologists in the process. And it's a matter of realization of what you're hearing. And if you want to work in games and you're a good sound person, you're probably going to be able to figure out how to do a little bit of scripting if you haven't already. And I think some tool set, certainly a friendly tool set like Wise, is not harder than a typical DAW, it's not a one-to-one, but it's the same general idea. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I've had the best experiences when I've worked with any game developer on any game is when I've had a committed, if not a programmer, a scripting programmer on my team that reported to me so that I could do these things. That's a blessing, right? But it's gotten me thinking how important that is. The nice thing is, at least that has come downstream from hardcore C++ programming to either something like, in Unreal, you have your graphic scripting you can do, and C#, which is a little more basic in Unity. And I think for me, those two are definitely things I look for and will always, like, as part of a team. Like, does everybody need that? No, definitely not. But as part of any audio team, I want someone who can go in and script and do some of that work and meet the deep programmers at that point rather than further back. So even as a freelancer, I'm definitely looking for those skills, C# and any kind of graphic scripting ability and logic. The thing is, young students that I'm coming across have it, are already learning it, because more and more, like, it's become part of a curriculum that most students are getting some of anyway. Mm-hmm. And if they pick up Unreal because they just want to play around with it, they're gonna get some of that natural graphic scripting, whether they realize it's scripting or not. So the young people I've worked with a couple of interns, and they not only, they understand the conceptual of nonlinear thought and programming just like that, and they have gaming in their blood because they grew up with modern games. So my short answer is yes, but not exclusive.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I would say for me, as I touched on before, it's definitely helps. But you don't need to be like an in-depth scripter or a coder, but you have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to break something down from a creative conception into something that can be logically explained. So break it down into some sort of logical flow that you can communicate with a more technical artist and or programmer, and just make, as Guy was saying, to bridge that communication gap and avoid any misunderstanding or frustration. And I equate it to, you know, early on, and one of the best advice I got from when I was starting to do some film post-production work was, this is film. You're in a genre, you're in a milieu, understand the language of film.
Mhm.
It's great to know sound, but do you understand how, you know, how a shot is set up, how a scene is broken down, how understand the language of the medium you're in puts you further ahead. So similarly, games are a very technical platform. It's computer based. There's engineering involved. You don't need to be able to program yourself, but you need to be able to understand the language of the medium that you're in. You're in a technical medium, so understand how to communicate with other people within that medium as well.
Well, good. I think we've taken a great deal of your time for free, and I really, really appreciate it.
This was for free?
Yeah. Oh, did I say that out loud?
Should I turn the clock back? No.
Checks in the mail.
Thanks.
Hey, I want to thank HelpNet for putting this whole thing together, and again, Guy for stepping in at very, very last minute for the sorely missed Becky Allen. And Charles, thank you very much for your time, and Gordon. Yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that. And thanks to everybody who listened and hung out and left questions and all that stuff. And anyway, keep doing great work, everybody.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. Good to see everybody.
Good luck, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.